So, John Donald Tusk telling us there that Europe's not pleased with Britain withdrawing from the European Union, but Europe is now more unified. Is he putting a positive spin on this, perhaps terrified that other countries in Europe may emulate Britain?
We don't actually have anyone thinking about having a referendum on leaving, but there's obviously clear divisions. There's the north-south division, with the rich places like Germany being very unhappy about what they regard as the profligate Greeks. There's also the west-east division, where you've got countries like Hungary taking a very, very tough line indeed on migration, whereas you've got Sweden and Germany who have welcomed very large numbers of them. There are lots of tensions. I mean, will it hold together? I think it's very hard to say. What I do think would be very bad for it was for the EU to be seen as an organisation that punishes dissenters and unbelievers in the project. I mean, it's going to put itself in very poor company. Think of places like North Korea or the Soviet Union or the Inquisition. Does the EU really want to have that tighter control on its members as those sorts of organisations? I hope not. But,
okay.
You know, if they are wanting to punish us, that's really what it's going to reduce them to.
All right, Gordon, Sean, I'm going to come to you, but Sean first. Go ahead.
Well, I didn't come here to the studio and expect the Spanish Inquisition, but then nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, as we say in Britain. I think there are some really fundamental facts here that we need to bear in mind. The first is that the British need the Europeans economically more, even more, than the Europeans need the British. Britain does run a trade deficit with Europe, it's true. People like the German car makers love the British market. The British love their cars. That's all true. But 80% of our car exports go to the European Union, thereabouts. And it's a big industry, again, in Britain now, and a successful one. Whereas maybe 10%, 15% of the whole of the European car industry's exports go to Britain. So there is an imbalance, and that's replicated all the way along. If the UK just disappeared and didn't buy anything, the Europeans would notice, but they wouldn't collapse. It's the other way around for us. Our car industry would collapse if the Europeans disappeared. It's as stark as that. The second thing is the 2-year timetable. Then, first of all, we're arguing about the ground rules, about whether we talk about the divorce bill before we start talking about the trade arrangements in the New World. Nobody's settled that. That's on day one. It's not going well. The French are having elections. The Germans are having elections all the way to October. So no one's really going to start making any proper decisions until towards the end of the year. Now, the longer this goes on, the worse it is for Britain, because the closer you get to just falling off the edge of the negotiations. That's what happens if you don't have an agreement. If you don't have an agreement, and by 2 years, and the Europeans don't agree to sort of extend the talks forever and a day, and the British don't wish to, then you fall out, then you go to World Trade Organization rules. Yes, you get your sovereignty back, but you will pay a very heavy price in terms of the exchange rate, investment, jobs, and all the rest of it, inflation too. You'd have some very bad economic effects, at least in the short term. So these are real problems that we have. And we've actually been here before. Somebody said that it'd be great if the economists could just all get together and have a rational answer. I would agree with that. Unfortunately, we have been here before. In the 1960s, when the British were begging the Europeans, 6 nations in those days only in Western Europe, to come into what was then the common market, the European communities, it would have made sense for all concerned, for Britain to come into the European communities, along maybe with Ireland and Denmark, right, as eventually happened in 1973. But General de Gaulle, who was, shall we say, a little bit prejudiced against the Anglo-Saxons, a very suspicious man of the British-American alliance, and all that sort of thing, he just said no, 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 all the way through, even though it was irrational. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen again, but what I am saying is that you cannot underestimate politicians, you cannot underestimate bitterness, and you cannot underestimate their capacity to be irrational.
Okay, let me go to Gordon. Gordon, to John's point that Europe is being intolerant here of dissenters.
Well, first of all, it's fancy. The European Union does about 3% of the government in the UK. It's a tiny layer. The European civil service is smaller than the Scottish civil service. And this whole trade world is completely wrong. If you go back to the beginning of free trade, when Scotland made half the world's locomotives, you took Scottish coal, Scottish steel, and you built an entire object and then exported it with a single, simple customs union. Nobody manufactures like that anymore. What you now have is manufacturing, like German car manufacturing has 6,000 or 7,000 components of car coming from Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, all over. Those objects, the door handle, the window, have to move across borders without customs checks to reduce that cost. Eliminating those requires coordination of regulation. And when we look at the current age, the SNP came to power, there were no iPhones, no tablets, no Bitcoin, no self-driving cars. Those things, and this is only 10 years ago, I have in my pocket a mobile phone. It allows me to do tariff-free commerce across the whole of Europe. But in order to do that, if I wish to sell to a German, I need a German speaker with me. And when you look at those kind of things, the biggest tech company in Scotland, Skyscanner, was in 4 languages when it had 6 employees. Free movement of people is necessary in the digital age to build the economy. And John's comments about Hungary are hilarious. The second biggest Hungarian city in the world is that city, the city of London. London is the second biggest Hungarian city in the world with 280,000 Hungarians in it. It's just, of course, Europe has differences. And what Europe has agreed on is that we resolve them peacefully through the European Union. And the UK has trashed out of this. I worked in Belfast. We had a civil war in Belfast, 90,000 people driven from their homes, car bombs, all sorts of hell. We resolved that with the peace process with our European Union neighbour Ireland. We share sovereignty with the Republic of Ireland. We have intergovernmental bodies. We have all these complicated things. And that has just been torn up by effectively petulant English nationalism, attempting to recreate Empire 2.0. Let us come back to the real world. We wish to sell things to Europeans. We want Europeans to come here, and we need to talk to our neighbours, in a fundamental way and get away from this fantasy world of going back to the 1870s. It simply does not exist.
All right, Tom, getting back to some of the things that Gordon has been saying there, talking about trade, let's take a listen to what Prime Minister Theresa May told the British Parliament. Let's watch this.
We will pursue a bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the European Union that allows for the freest possible trade in goods and services between Britain and the EU's member states, that gives British companies the maximum freedom to trade with and operate within European markets, and that lets European businesses do the same in Britain.
So the Prime Minister wants a good trade deal with Europe there. Is she going to get it?
I think that the odds are good. I mean, I can't sit here and say it's absolutely 100% going to happen, of course. I mean, I think the timeline is certainly challenging. But, I think what a lot of people forget is, OK, they'll look at other trade deals around the world and they say, that took 7 years to negotiate, that took 10 years, and it's still not nearly as good a trade deal as we already have with the European Union. I think this is a truly unique situation. When before have 2 sides come to negotiate a trade deal?
Let me ask you this. Is the perfect scenario for Britain being, we'd like a good trade deal, but we don't want those immigration components in it?
I mean, that wouldn't be my favoured option, certainly. I'm much more pro-immigration than I suspect most people on the Leave side would be. But ultimately, I think that is the government's ambition. They have taken from the referendum result. I'm not sure this was a correct interpretation, actually, but they think that they really have to do something to reduce net migration from the EU into the UK to deliver on the promise of Brexit. Now, to me, Brexit was about a simple question. Do we leave the political institutions of the European Union? The government has chosen to read more into that. Yes, I think that's certainly what they're going to try and pursue. But I think we need to realise, first of all, we already have 0 tariffs. We already have integrated customs systems. We already have the exact same set of regulations, essentially. So this should be the easiest trade deal of all time to negotiate, leaving aside the politics. I think it's also important to point out, whatever happens, even if Britain does not manage to conclude a comprehensive trade deal in 2 years, and even if the transitional arrangements are not as we would wish them to be, most of Britain's trade happens with countries other than the EU. Now, I'm not saying that to suggest the European Union is not important to us. No. What I am saying is trade happens all the time between countries that do not have trade agreements.
Okay.
It's better to have them, certainly, but Britain would not fall off a cliff in the absence of a conclusive deal.
Very quickly, Gordon.
Integrated customs mean that if a widget arrives in Liverpool, it can then be transshipped to France without being stopped again. Under the new regulation, any widget arriving in Liverpool that is then transshipped would have to go through, even if it's tariff-free, would have to go through customs management going into France. So eliminating the external boundary through customs unions is critical. And the point, I mean, I also don't agree. I don't believe this is a zombie apocalypse if we leave the European Union. But the reason for trade deals is to increment trade and national economy by 3-4% and alter your growth trend rate. And the growth trend rate for the UK will go down until it can negotiate new trade deals. And the political problem that the British government have is that the people they want to drive the sort of new Singapore, London economy voted overwhelmingly to remain. That's the constituency they pretend they like. And the people who voted to get out are the people who loathe the idea of Singapore, people who are in the neglected north and the neglected west. And what the UK is trying to do is avoid its internal constitutional problems, the Irish problem, the Scottish problem, the problem of the north of England by grandstanding in the international world. And that's the fundamental threat to the UK, is a politics of delusion, not this boring politics of trade that they're trying to get out of.
OK, Sean, I've got about a minute left. These are complex negotiations. There's a timeline on it, a time frame on it, 2 years. What happens if there's no agreement in the next 2 years?
Well, nobody knows that either. I suspect what it means is that if the Europeans say that they don't want to extend and they don't want to have a transitional arrangement, and or the British say the same thing, then we do crash out. In some industries, it would mean a 5% tariff, a 10% tariff. For others, it's 100% tariff. It's almost punitive. Well, it is punitive in effect. And we wouldn't have other arrangements with other countries in the world to make up the difference. Also, you know, the management, as your other guest was saying, of all the supply chains that run across Europe, the non-trade, the non-goods activity that we have, architect services, service industries, people moving across borders, having their professional qualifications mutually recognised, all that would disappear. Right. Absolutely disappear. It's unprecedented that any country goes from full fair free trade, a single market, a customs union, to something back from there. Usually what people want to do is pull down the barriers. This is the first example where all the barriers are down. We want to start putting them up. Okay. This is unprecedented.
All right.
I think there'll be a 10-year transitional agreement which will involve continued immigration and continued money, and Britain will have the worst of all worlds. I mean, Scotland will be gone, Northern Ireland will be in trouble, and you'll be paying money to Europe, having no say over the rules and looking like complete idiots.
All right, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.